Hi all, let's look at another amazing game from the Norway chess tournament, one of the strongest being played so far this year. So this was the game from round 2. Magnus Carlsen had just lost a game on time in round 1, so very freak circumstances, because the tournament's time format had changed from the previous year. Magnus had been late to the press conference, and had not registered the rule change, so he'd lost in the previous round on the rather sad circumstances from arguing a winning position. So in round 2, playing against Fabiano Caruana with the black pieces wasn't so pleasant, because Caruana is pretty formidable in his own right. 2805 federated, Magnus 2876 of course. So Magnus chose e5, and he goes into a very solid Berlin defense, so this early knight f6 here. So WhiteElo has Berlin defense, and we get a very popular continuation here, well trodden, castles, knight takes d4, and this is leading to an exchange of queens where white doubles the pawns here, and we have this d takes e5, and black gets the bishop pair. So both sides have their trump cards from the opening. It's how well they carry these through to the middle game and the end game. In the end game, you see that with the double pawns here, maybe white has potential for a passed pawn sometimes in the end game, and actually Caruana has proven that passed pawn majority to be quite significant. He's won games against other super GMs such as Michael Adams in this variation. In fact, Caruana is considered one of the strongest players with the white pieces in the Berlin defense, and he's often able to use things like the pawn majority. So the trump cards and how they're used will decide the game really, or if it's going to be a solid draw, which is another often happening result here from this very solid opening. We see h3, h6, rook d1 check, king e8, knight c3, and we're going transitioning into a very popular position even here. There's 74 games with what was played, knight e7. So b3 is just as popular as knight d4, 18 games both in my book. So it's still a very trodden territory. Here knight g6 seems to be a little bit more popular than bishop f5, which was what was played. So there's 14 games of knight g6, 3 with bishop f5. Knight d4, so protecting that pawn, hitting the bishop. Bishop drops back. Bishop b2. Rook d8. You might think, by the way, what if the kick, well, knight b5 looks at c7, so I can't nab a pawn or anything. So rook d8, knight ce2, knight d5, c4, knight b4. It looks as though there's a little bit of coordination here between these two pieces, and in fact d3 seems significant. Maybe knight d3 is annoying. That's extinguished here, knight f4, covering d3. It's pretty harmless to play knight. Well, knight c2 is covered anyway with that knight. So these two key squares are covered with both knights here. The coordination is of no significance right now. Now Magnus plays a rather interesting move here. In fact, up until this point at move 17, this might have been all Fabiano's preparation. His moves were apparently rattled out quite quickly. And here we see a new kind of interesting move in this position, rook g8. And it seems to be designed to protect this pawn. So any e6 idea with knight h5, the bishop might be useful, and with the rook protecting g7 in some variations. So protecting g7 in advance of things like knight h5, I think is one of the main ideas here. For example, e6, bishop d6 might be possible without knight h5 gaining a tempo on g7 necessarily. So here we see an interesting plan for white, which has been seen before. In fact, there was a very interesting battle between Judith Polgar and Garry Kasparov in a rapid chess game, where Judith Polgar actually defeated Kasparov with a similar plan. In this structure with the pawn on h6, getting a knight on f5 can actually get a small positional advantage, or try and discourage black to hold on to the bishop here, a knight on f5. And in fact this next move emphasizes that it's a slight Achilles heel of the black position here, that f5 square, and this has been echoed in some very interesting games in the past. This g4 was played to support knight f5. What else to do with the knight on d4? You know, black's never going to really play c5 in a hurry and things like that, e5. So putting a knight on f5, where it's more difficult to kick it than usual with g6, because often, you know, h6 will be a problem, or there might be some other problems. We see now Magnus playing an undeveloping move, knight a6. And although it's the Berlin defense, yes, tempo is still important if the position can get opened up advantageously. It's difficult to see how the position can be opened up with advantage, because black's always got that bishop pair. You know, often opening up the position with the opponent having the bishop pair is a little bit more dangerous and double-edged. So here, you know, it looks tempting to play a move like e6, but no, more patiently, knight f5, just following on from the g4 move, trying to probe for some weaknesses. G6, for example, would create some weaknesses which might be exploitable. It might actually even be unplayable here to play G6. Well, it's very tempting. It might actually be unplayable. Let me just do a quick check on that. Apparently, it's an advantage for white here. White doesn't have to retreat the knight necessarily. There might be a move like E6 here, believe it or not. And this might be a little bit tricky. So, for example, takes here, takes, and this is tricky all of a sudden. This is a big advantage. But so black's best. This gets very tricky after this move. Yeah, black's best might be this. This, believe it or not, this is dangerous for black. So black really, it doesn't seem as though black has to tread carefully with the move like G6, which would seem to kick the knight. Yeah, there's some variations there to support the fact that it seems very dangerous. So Magnus is treading carefully around this E6 possibility. He actually plays knight C5 now, trying to mark that E6 a bit more, like a defender in football marking an attacking player, that E6 pawn. Potential for E6. We see here now rook takes, king takes, rook d1 check, and the king now goes to c8. And a very interesting move now, bishop a3, which seems to be designed against the move which Magnus plays anyway. And so maybe this was a small miscalculation on Magnus Carlsen's part here, what to do in this particular position. There is a certain amount of annoying pressure in this position to do with the e6 possibilities. Magnus actually chose knight e6. It's a tricky position already. Let's just check here, just to make sure. It's a tricky position. That might not be the top engine choice. In fact, in this position, it seems, you know, something like maybe less committal, like a6 might be viable. But yeah, after knight e6, it's as if there's a forcing sequence here, which seems to give white a small but significant positional advantage now in this position. White plays knight takes e6 for a moment now, giving up both bishops. It looks too dangerous to play f takes e6. Let's check that as well. F takes e6. There's a killer move actually in this position. Can you see it? There's actually a killer move. Instead of taking on f8, that leads to nothing. Knight e7 leads to not much either, but there is actually a move here which stops f takes e6 being actually viable. If I give you 5 seconds, what would you play here with white? Interesting resource in this position. Okay, it's bishop e7. Yes, there's incredible stuff behind the scenes with rook d8 now being threatened. What does black do here? Can't take here because of knight takes e7, forking king and rook. And if his best is b6 or b5, check. And yes, bishop takes f8. Here e6 now, and this pawn is pretty menacing. If bishop g6, this position here starts to look really bad. G takes, trying to distract away from e8 and win a piece. That actually is kind of winning a piece potentially. White can simply I think just simply when a piece with a big advantage, there might even be other torturous moves here like f4. So yeah, it seems as though in this critical position here, f takes e6 is not possible. So this is going into an interesting forcing sequence here. Bishop takes a3. So at this very moment in time on this game position, black has the bishop pair, white has the knight pair, but the knight pair is pretty destructive on g7. Even after black's prophylaxis, it seems, with rook g8 earlier, knight e takes g7. So what is happening here? Is white getting away with this? The thing is now e6 is really on the cards again as quite a destructive little move. Black plays bishop f8. And now the knight can't move because bishop takes f5 with that pin. We see now e6 finally here. And black relinquishes the bishop pair. If he doesn't, he's in severe trouble. If he takes on g7, then check, and then we take here, and the back row mate is then threatened. So that's winning. So Magnus is in a very difficult position. He plays bishop takes f5, and the transition here with knight against bishop seems very favourable for white for structural reasons and pass pawn reasons. If we look at this position now, if we take stock of this position. The knight has some comfortable light square outpost squares away from the glare of the bishop, e4 and h5. White also has this very comfortable pawn majority here because the pawns have been more fragmented, and it's actually almost like these three are against this one only. This one might not be so significant. The potential for getting a 2-0 pawn majority of f4 and g5 at some point, trying to get rid of the h6 pawn. And we see this happening now, this evolving from this position where the knight has these beautiful squares. All the pawns for white are on light squares away from the bishop. So the bishop's a bit of a spectator here, nothing to attack. The king goes up, and we see now rook d3 as though, let's get the rooks off. Let's simplify to this knight and bishop ending. Rook f7. The knight perches itself on h5 here. And we see bishop d6. Rook f3, welcoming an exchange of rooks. Magnus is in a very difficult position here in this ending. It's hardly very happy without the bishop pair. We're white going with this pawn majority, putting some more pressure on that pawn on e6. Now f4, protected by the perched knight on h5. So g5 would create potentially two connected passed pawns here. Bishop a3. No rush to play g5 here. Maybe there's some resources like bishop c1 to factor in. The king just goes up a bit. Bishop b2. Rook e2, hitting the bishop. And now g5 here. So two passed pawns are potentially on the cards if taking. With this pawn easy to blockade, it would be looking like a crushing passed pawn roller there. King d7, king g4. Now knight g3 is played, supporting things like knight e4 and maybe even f5 in the future. But first also, this pawn can also come as well to h4, which it does. So the knight is also holding up against any h5. So it seems, black's not really able to create a passed pawn. These double pawns are significant in this ending for being a real problem for passed pawn potential. h5, on the other hand, white's getting a protected passed pawn here very soon with a pawn on g6. So c5, g6, protected passed pawn. And it also means now that any f5, if taking, knight takes, this pawn will be a target. And that's what happens next now. Rook e8, f5. And yes, e5 is a nightmare. f6 free connected passed pawns with f7 coming. So e takes f5. And here, I think king takes f5 is possible with advantage. There's no major punishment for that either. But king f4 is played. It's going to collect the f5 pawn in a more leisurely pace. Doesn't matter. Rook h8. Knight takes f5, and it's a dream position for white. Yes, protected passed pawn. White just needs to push through with g7 soon. Bishop f6, rook g2, preparing g7. And here Magnus had enough. He resigned. It's a very difficult position. It's impossible really to do much here in this position. Let's continue. Let's give us some examples just to show this. King E8, G7 here. This progress can be made with Rook G6 and the use of exchange sack if needed to break through here. So with white threatening, if Bishop G5 for example, white could use an exchange sack and this would be a winning position here with H6. Yes, so pretty devastating stuff there in the final position. It's pretty hopeless after Rook G2. So it seems to be a logical, smooth performance by Caruana, and he's done this before against Super Grandmasters, exploiting that potential for a passed pawn on the king side. So yes, this was a very unfortunate pairing the day after a very unfortunate event for Magnus to end up being on half out of 2 after round 2. Yeah, very difficult tournament. Very difficult opponent, and despite playing a very solid opening, maybe one of the worst people to play against Caruana, who seems to be gaining some wins from this variation. He's becoming known as like the main guru in this line with white against the Berlin defense. Very powerful stuff. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.